Camille Claudel was a remarkable French sculptor. And I thought it'd be wonderful to start off with this quotation, which was something a critic said, "A revolt against nature, a woman genius." Well, so there's definitely some high praise there, but it's also interesting that the fact that a woman could be a genius was a revolt against nature. She grew up in a small village where her father was a civil servant. The name Camille can be either male or female, and she was given the name of her brother who had died. She was very close to her younger brother, Paul. And Paul did become an artist as well, but in literature. He was a poet and playwright. She started at age 12, as far as we know, in 1876, when she was modeling figures in terracotta. Now, obviously, these childhood images, figures have been lost, but she's said to have used family and servants as models, and she'd done subjects that of like famous men, Bismarck, Napoleon, religious scenes such as David and Goliath. She started taking some lessons 3 years later. With a sculptor, Alfred Brocher. And in 1881, she went to Paris. Now, a young woman could not just sort of go off to Paris alone. So her mother and her siblings came with her. And her father actually transferred. At first he was left and then he transferred. And he remains with his job separated from his family in order to support them. But his father really approved of her artistic training and of her developing her abilities. However, as we'll see, her mother does not, and she does not seem to have been as close to her mother. In Paris, she attended the Académie, and I'm not sure of the pronunciation, Colarossi. The Académie Colarossi allowed female students, and they allowed women to study nude models. She couldn't go to the École des Beaux-Arts. It did not allow women. And here is her earliest extant signed portrait. It's a portrait of a young man. It's believed to represent her brother, Paul. And so we're seeing what she is doing right now at age 17. And you'll notice the slide says before she meets Rodin. And I think that's very important because many of these women artists who have had relationships with famous male artists, whether it's as a lover or whether it's as a husband, oftentimes it seems to be hard to see the female artist separated from that. And so she's almost always discussed as I was going to say an appendage, that's not very nice, to Rodin, but in relationship to her relationship with Rodin. But I think that this shows that she was already an accomplished artist before she ever met Rodin. So her genius, and we might as well use that word since the critic did, and her talents and her abilities are not dependent on the famous male artist. She's already starting to develop them even as a teenager. This is another one of her early works. It is Helen in old age, so this is one of the family servants. And her very early style, as you can see, here she's 17 or 18 years old. It's a very realistic style, strongly modeled. You have the structure of the bones. You also have all of the the things that happen to your face with old age, wrinkles, parts that sag, and yet it's all perfectly worked together, this very, very strong, earthy realism. She really does understand anatomy. And this is her first exhibited work. She exhibited not in the bronze that you see here, but in terracotta. And this is true, of course, of other artists. For example, Degas, he would make works in, I think it was wax, clay, and only maybe after his death would they be cast into bronze. But a lot of times when the artist is just starting out, they can't really afford bronze casting. So they may exhibit them in the terracotta or plaster or more ephemeral materials, and then later they can have these cast. And here we can see this from several points of view. And this very strong profile, there's a real sense of character about it. Well, to be perfectly frank, you don't talk about Camille Claudel without talking about Rodin. And this is her portrait of Auguste Rodin, which was first in terracotta and here cast into bronze. She met Rodin in 1883. And of course, he was much older than her. As you can see, he's 24 years older than she is. Her former teacher had gone to Italy. He had achieved the Prix de Rome, which was this wonderful prize from the French Academy, from the Salon, to go to Rome. So Rodin kind of took over his students and was supervising them. And he fell in love with this beautiful young woman. And their intimate relationship begins. In 1883, she first exhibited at the Salon. And you'll remember that the Salon was the official government exhibition that, if you were a French artist, you had to get into the Salon to be recognized as an artist, essentially. By 1885, she had become Rodin's assistant. And she has been called his muse, in a sense. She's been called his pupil, although she was already accomplished when she met him. His assistant, part of some of his great works of art, like the Gates of Hell, were actually, of course, created by Claudel. She was a model, and here we see two images by Rodin that used Camille Claudel as the model. She was his lover and eventually his rival. As an assistant, she models parts of Rodin's most famous statues. And there is a kind of mutual collaboration, which I found quite interesting. He is much older than her, but many of the same themes that they have do seem to emerge simultaneously in their work. Or there are examples, I'm going to show you one, where it seems that Rodin was influenced by Claudel, not the other way around, which is usually assumed. Now, she separates herself from her family. Of course, they would disapprove of her affair, and that would be very natural. But she is not making money, so she's financially dependent on Rodin, and that dependency is, I think, it has to poison the relationship in some respects. when you're dependent on someone else. And it's also not an equal relationship in any sense of the word. Rodin continues his relationship with his longtime lover and the mother of his son, Rose, and once again, I'm not sure the pronunciation, Beret. He does marry her shortly before her death in 1917, and he does not marry Claudel. So I would probably say it's not a very healthy relationship between Claudel and Rodin, but it certainly is one of the strongest emotional relationships of her entire life. It has been suggested that she modeled the hands and the feet in the burghers of Calais, and they are remarkable. I have one detail here where you can see how expressive the hands are, and the feet actually are extremely expressive as well. Now, I promised to show you something where it seems that the influence went from Claudel to Rodin. And you'll notice the dates here are similar. I got this from a book in which it assumed that Rodin's Galatea, which is almost exactly the same pose as Claudel's Girl with a Sheath, that they were created about the same time. However, if you go to the Musée Rodin website, it has much more specific dates for these. It shows Claudel's design as 1887, 2 years before Rodin's Galatea of 1889. And I'm going to make a guess that the same dates were based on the assumption that the female, younger artist had to be dependent on the male. And I'm also going to make the assumption that the Musée Rodin knows what they're talking about because the dates they have are extremely specific. So let's look at it with those dates. So I put a question mark because I probably would, let me take out that question mark. If we're going to accept, and I think we should probably, the Musée Rodin's dating of these, you can see that the pose of the Claudel girl is then repeated in the Rodin statue. They're two different media, but there's this great similarity. So there is undoubtedly, I would say, there's a mutual give and take between these two extremely talented artists. And, this isn't unusual that, two great artists will borrow things from each other. I mean, there's many other examples in the history of art. This version of The Girl with the Sheath is in the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And I should mention that some of these things that are cast, there are sometimes a number of them. And so you may find them in different museums. We mentioned the Rodin Museum, for example. Because when you cast, for example, cast in bronze, of course, you can cast multiples. And also this is true of I know of Rodin's work, that they have the casts of some of them, and the Rodin Foundation basically will release sometimes new versions of new castings of his works of art. For example, in I think it was 85, mid 80s, there was a wonderful Rodin show at the National Gallery in Washington, and they newly cast the burghers of Calais for that show, and you could see it in the bronze colored. And then I believe it's the same burghers of Calais that's now in the Smithsonian Sculpture Garden across from the Hirshhorn, and of course it has oxidized somewhat over the years. So if you see this for another museum, that would be the reason. Okay, let's look at some of the stylistic elements of this. The pose, we mentioned the pose before. It's a kind of twisting posture. She's looking over her shoulder. Her hand is very close to her body and it's pulled up to her shoulder. Her knees are twisting the opposite way from her head, so you've got a kind of contrapposto. And the knees are modestly placed together, of course. It's also something that you could, I don't have the pictures to show you, but you can look at it from different sides. And it will be interesting from all of these different views, even if you feel there is a particular view that maybe seems to be the main view that it's photographed. Sign. It's small scale. It's about 14 inches high. And this would be something that would appeal to private collectors, and you could create a edition out of this. So you have several editions. There is one terracotta that survives, and 12 versions that were created in bronze. And in this case, the artist, is issuing multiples, but is retaining a certain edition. And the work itself, it emphasizes, we say, the artist's hand. You can see some different textures here, the difference between the smooth, but not overly smooth, flesh, the textures of the hair, the textures of the rock. And you have this feeling that you still see the mark of the artist, even in the castings. They retain that from the terracotta model. One of the things here that we're talking about is, of course, this is not quite as exactly the same image, but there is that theme of passionate love between the male and the female. And one of the books that I read said, it emerges about the same time in Claudel and Rodin. And people like to see kind of autobiographical connections with this. But at any rate, here's two similarities. It talks about Claudel's personal style emerging. Well, her personal style had already emerged when she was a teenager, but certainly she develops in different ways. And here she's showing, this passionate love between the male and the female. And as you can see, she receives a honorable mention award for her plaster version of the statue. The subject that she's giving it is from a Hindu love story, essentially. And sometimes, we'll see this, there'll be similar statues that will be given variant titles, and they might be worked out in different media as well. But these two artists are working closely together, so there certainly probably could be mutual influence. And I thought it was interesting to sort of take sometimes the same subject or a similar image and show you both of them. Rodin's Aurora is the same title, you might say the same theme, the goddess of the dawn, is very different than Claudel's, which is a child's face, but seems to be emerging from the form that becomes both clouds and hair in a sense. Rodin's is actually believed to be based on Camille Claudel's face, that she was the model for this. And of course, Rodin does a number of these figures and faces that emerge from the rough-hewn block. It's his reaction to Michelangelo's unfinished statues, which has the often the nude figure seeming to, as I was struggling with the rocky block, and they're unfinished for Michelangelo. Now, many of them were created for the Julia's tomb. But Rodin has seen the potential in that, and of course he's also seen the potential of the Greek statuary that sometimes in pieces, we don't have the entire forms, such as the Nike of Samothrace without her head and hands, and he sometimes will do parts of the body as just as expressive as the whole body. So here is one of those figures that's emerging from the rock. Claudel's doing something a bit different with it. She's not only showing, aurora, the dawn, as though the child is emerging, but the stone, which is, it's not rough, it's softer almost. It's a very different interpretation. And here she did do a series where she had used children. And you can see this in different media, in marble, in bronze. There's all sorts of different things that you have to do with images of children. And of course, one of my favorite children's sculptors would be a Desideria Settignane, who's just perfect, but there is this softness about the form that she's captured beautifully. Now, like I say, many times people like to relate things of the artist, and I think particularly women artists, to what happened in their life. And it has been suggested that her interest in children may relate to the fact that she lost a child, that she had a miscarriage, or it could have even been an abortion. I don't know that that's known. Rodin, as far as I know, doesn't use children as models. So this is a whole area of artistic exploration that Claudel is following, that is not part of, there can be no artistic dependency. It's a totally different theme that she's using here. The difficult, I was going to say poisonous, but maybe I should just say difficult relationship with Rodin, and her feeling of rivalry with Madame Rodin continues for a number of years. And she decides she needs to make a break. And in 1892 to 1905, she rents her own studio. And then in 1898, she has what has been called the final break with Rodin, and it may be the personal break, but according to the Rodin website, Rodin did continue to, try to help her behind the scenes sometimes. She creates works that are extremely emotive, very sensual. And once again, people try to say, well, this has to do with the emotions that she's feeling in her personal life. It's also, of course, her genius, her creativity, that she's going to move in new directions, as it were. One of her most famous works of art is this one, which is the Waltz. And there's a kind of diagonal curving movement that goes upward. Originally, evidently, she did this as nude figures and then added the draperies. And it's interesting how she uses those draperies, because they essentially contrast with and complete the movement of the bodies. Now, the textures contrast, but the whole flow of the work is enhanced by the use of drapery. We don't usually see Rodin using draperies, so she's trying something different here. And we also see another thing that she does that Rodin does not do, is using different kinds of semi-precious stones, such as onyx. In small-scale sculpture, where she has, say, the bronze figures with, I'm going to call it an onyx setting, or a different stone. these are her small, intimate sculpture, and we'll be seeing some examples of those. So those are two different things we're going to look at now. Here we're looking at her sculpture of Clotho. Clotho was the fate who spun the thread of life in Greek mythology, and she decided who was born, who lived, who died. You may know the story of the three fates. They spin the thread of life, and one of them cuts it at the death. And there's all different ways to portray the fates. She's portraying Clotho as this elderly hag, extremely old, with the breasts have completely flattened and sagged. The forms of the body are sagging. I mean, this is the person who has the goddess who lives forever but ages. And that idea of life and here death that she controls is part of her bodily image. And you also see this this garment that goes, what is it, a veil, a mantle? It's going over her face, so her face is in shadow. Death, maybe in shadow. Very complex forms. And here are some of these small, precious little sculptures. In this case, she's carved the figures from and I believe it's onyx, but from the precious stone here. It adds an element of color. It adds that idea of the precious materials, the things that gemstones or jewelry could even be made out of. They're called little things, and they're decorative works. And this is nothing. This is nothing like Rodin. It's a whole different range and type of work that she's creating. This one's called, of course, we're translating the titles, either the gossips or the chatterers, from 1893, and this seems to be about the date when she starts doing some of these little things with the precious, semi-precious stones. And so you have these sort of female figures in the nude, all talking together, intimate little setting. Another one of these works, here we have the gossips, we have the details. You should see she's worked at it in plaster and then has carved it into stone, and you can see it from different points of view. Another one of these, which has a lot of very dramatic movement to it, is the wave. And I found several dates on this. And I also found it stated that it was about 1893 that she started doing these works. It may be that there's different versions. It said that this was influenced by the Japanese woodcut, the wave, which of course is probably the most famous Japanese woodcut in the Western world, with this great wave curving up. And you can see that in the stonework here. But she's added figures. Claudel always uses figural sculpture. And you have marble, onyx, bronze, kind of mixed media that has a variety of colors. You would say it's polychromatic, that each of the different materials adds its own color and texture to the work. And here we're looking at it from a different point of view. These women who are almost dancing in the wave. This is green onyx, and as you can see, it also has some golden parts to it. You have this feeling of action and movement as the curve sweeps up and sort of cups around the women playing in the water. There's a kind of playfulness about it as well. Or are the women menaced? I suppose you could see that as well, because you could imagine the wave crashing down on them. But this is within these decorative, precious artworks. And here we're going to look at a number of details and different points of view of the statue known as the Waltz. You can see there's a range of dates. 1891, where she's working on it, to 1905. So she's modeling this, she's working on it, and then eventually it's cast in bronze, and there is an edition created of it. As I said, it's probably her most famous work. It was originally intended to be a nude statue of these two figures dancing in the waltz. Today, I don't think we think of the waltz as being particularly erotic, as very beautiful, but then they did. Here the couple is clasped together, and then you put them in the nude, and there was an outcry against the two nude dancing figures. They just felt that this was very erotic and perhaps not something the general public should be looking at. And she added the drapery. She doesn't completely cover the figures, however. The drapery then becomes part of the swirling movement. And as I said, it gives you this wonderful contrast of textures and the movement of the entire composition. So I'm just going to show you some details that I was able to find and from different points of view. So here we're looking at the two figures close together. At different points of view from the back, from the other side. And you can say that the long drapery becomes part of the pedestal as well. She also will take a subject, a theme, and as we said, use it in different materials. And sometimes she'll call it by different names. They'll give them different titles. And so here you see, titles from Hindu. I was going to say legend or mythology. I don't know. Maybe it's supposed to be history, but from a Hindu love story, a romance of the woman and the king come together, and then she's cursed, and he forgets her, but eventually they are reunited. Another more general name of l'abandon, abandonment to their passions, abandonment to their love, maybe rather than leaving each other. What does it mean by l'abandon? Which you create it in bronze, and then you have a classical Greco-Roman myth of lovers when she creates it in marble. But these embracing figures. This is another small-scale work. It's just this incredibly lively pose, and it seems as the parts are sort of going every which way. And if you kind of think of high-pitched, fluttering flute music, it really reproduces that in a physical, in bronze in this case. So here we're the flute player with a lively pose and the drapery somewhat, or some angular, some curving, sort of moving in different directions. And all of this diagonal movement. And it does give a kind of visualization of the trill of a flute player, of the flute music. So it's a very musical piece, as you can see. And I've only got the two views, but I think you can see that it'd be very interesting looking at it from different points of view as well. Classical mythology again. Perseus and the Gorgon. And it's said that she did use some of her features with the Gorgon, Medusa. She's created this in, once again, several media, in bronze and in marble. And in 1895, she acquired a patron who really helped her, because if you have someone who's buying your work, you can survive. And it gives her the greater independence that she can survive without Rodin supporting her. So the Countess Arthur de Marguerite becomes her patron. And the large Perseus and the marble Vertumnus and Pomona are created for this new patron. In a sense, it's a more conventional sculpture and a more conventional topic. You have influence from, of course, the one we think of would be Cellini's Perseus, where he holds aloft the head of the Medusa. But we also see the body and the wings of the Gorgon Medusa lying at the feet of Perseus, who has killed her. Unfortunately, there was a quarrel between artist and patron, and that ended the patronage. But, let's look at the details here. This is one of her large-scale sculptures, and it's called, well, translated, the Age of Maturity. In other words, old age here. And as you see an old man who is embraced by, presumably, an allegorical figure, perhaps death, and the young woman who seems to be imploring him not to leave her to death. One of the things that is often said about it is that it's a personal metaphor, that old woman who is embracing the old man refers to Rodin's lover and wife, and the young woman, Claudel, is begging her to stay. However, one of the things that I read about this that was quite interesting, once again on the Musée Rodin website, was that although people are very tempted to read personal life story into these pictures, it was actually originally created before the triangle came into being. That her earliest exhibit of it, and as I said, these come in sometimes in various versions, so that the conception of this was not, it could not be related to the emotional triangle of the Rodin and his two lovers. And when it was first exhibited, they interpreted it as destiny. That death is enveloping the aged man. We all will die. We all will age. And youth, he's losing his youth. He's being parted from those who are younger than he is. So it can be a metaphor rather than a personal statement. I'll leave you to decide, but if the dates of the earliest versions of these predate the affair with Rodin, then it seems to me that that's pretty strong evidence. So here we're looking at from the other side, very dramatic, and you can see the strong diagonal, the figure which is moving away. You really have a sense of movement. We all go toward death. One of the things that happened after the split with Rodin was that in many of her setbacks, Claudel blamed Rodin. She thought that he was preventing her from getting government purchases. For example, this was supposed to be purchased, and the purchase was canceled, and she thought this was Rodin's fault. Once again, according to the Rodin Museum website, this was not true. That she actually, he did try to get her commissions and work for that sort of behind the scenes. I obviously have no idea what was going on with this stormy relationship between the two. But, it does seem tragic that she's not receiving maybe the recognition and the purchases. She's still struggling. As I said, the Rodin, Musée Rodin website says that at times Rodin would without her knowledge, help pay for her studio or her home. Now, she then does get an art dealer, Eugene Blow. He becomes her agent, and she issues these bronze editions of over a dozen of her sculptures, including this figure, the Implorer, which, as you can see, was part of the larger Age of Maturity, and here issued as a separate figure, smaller one. She gives exhibitions in 1905, 1907, 1908, and he tries to obtain government commissions for her. Much later in her life, he says, "I have never ceased to be your friend." This continues that idea of those small-scale images that are created with precious materials as well and it's suggested they're very intimate. They are small. You have to look at them. I found this image that's deep thought of the woman against the fireplace. I found a reference that sounded like there were two different works with the woman before the fireplace and the deep thoughts. So at any rate, this is what my source had. It's a very small-scale figure, and the light would then radiate from the fireplace area, and it is intimate. In a sense, it's very personal. It's making you think about what this person might be feeling. Her life ends very sadly. She does seem to have psychological problems. She believes that Rodin is persecuting her. She thinks that he wants to kill her. And she thought that Rodin was preventing the government purchase of the Age of Maturity. One source I read said, well, that was probably true. And another source says, no, that it wasn't true. He was trying to help her. So what was true? I don't know. She thought Rodin had her committed to an asylum, which was not true. It was her mother who had her committed. And she seems to have also suffered greater senility as she got older. When her father died in 1913, and remember her father had supported her receiving artistic training, and the remaining family, the mother particularly, had Camille committed to a mental hospital, and that ended her artwork. At one point, she destroys a lot of her artwork. In 1920, a doctor writes a letter to her mother saying that she should return home. Presumably, she was not ill enough to be hospitalized for the rest of her life, or she was improved. She shouldn't be in an asylum. But her mother refused. Was it because of the scandal of her love affair with Rodin? I don't know. Did her mother feel she couldn't handle any problems? I don't know. But her mother would not let her return home. And so, as you can see, 30 years later, when she died, she was still hospitalized. And that's why I say it was a tragic ending to a great sculptor of genius.